She says we have 175 children, but we have more than that children. Yeah, because I add some more over the weekend before. Yeah, over the weekends before I come here. Yeah.
So I'm going to see Angela Oxford that does the Green Bay program with the Marshallese.
Yeah. I just love saying her name too.
Should I tell her?
No, no,
Do we have any slots left?
We still have some slots.
Okay, I'll tell
Yeah.
her about how many would be.
Well, I put a couple more, like
About
75,
25.
like, yeah,
Okay.
around that
Yeah.
number.
Is that for Dream Big?
Yeah, she was saying she added some more slots last night.
During the weekend before I fly out here, so Melissa doesn't know exactly the number.
When you get back, everything's in that box
Yeah.
that you need. And call me if you have any questions.
I will.
Yeah.
You have your cell number in your business card, right?
No.
The one you gave me?
No, but I'll give it to you. I'll give you another one.
Yeah, with the cell number, your cell phone number.
Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I thought I got off easy with just one breakout session yesterday, but I'm going to be introducing our speakers today as well. Thank you for joining our Culturally Tailored Research and Programs breakout session. If you were not planning on attending Culturally Tailored Research and Programs, you are in the wrong breakout. It's your time to sneak out the back of the room. Our first speakers are Dr. Marcia Shobe, Dr. Yvette Murphy-Irby, and Lucy Capelle. Dr. Shobe is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Arkansas. Her research, policy, and practice foci over the last 26 years have primarily been in the area of child, adolescent, and family well-being, particularly as it relates to health disparities for traditionally underserved populations. She has collaborated with experts in nursing, epidemiology, and health administration on studies related to the health behaviors and health literacy of low-income Latino immigrants. She has experience with substance abuse education, research, and practice experience with health and mental health, is fluent in French, and has some proficiency in Spanish. Dr. Shobe. Yvette Murphy-Irby received a BA from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte in 1985, and her MSW from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1991, with a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro in 2004. She's been employed with the University of Arkansas since 2004, serving as the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Associate Dean of the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences, and the Director of School of Social Work. Her professional and academic focus is on child welfare issues, as well as community economic development, social work training, and leadership development. We got one more. We got a big group here. Miss Lucy Capelle has been with the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese since 2015, where she has worked to improve infrastructure and capacity, engage stakeholders through interviews, focus groups, and town hall meetings, and work with community members to develop a 5-year strategic plan. Before that, she has worked with the Ministry of Education in the Republic of the Marshall Islands as a teacher and as a program manager for a substance abuse prevention and treatment program with the Youth to Youth and Health program. Let's welcome Lucy Capelle. All right, Dr. Shobe, you're up.
All right. We're all coming up.
All righty. Aloha. We're very excited to be here today to talk about a research collaborative project that we were working on. It's called the Marshallese Child Savings Account, Relationship Between Human Capital and Human Health. But before I get into that, I just want to say we've been talking about how meaningful this experience has been and how touching it has been. that there's a real sense of community here, and that's what we're all about, is community and connection and engagement. And so we talk about it, we get to teach about it, but to be in a room of folks that sort of understand that and value that is just really exciting. So please give yourselves a hand as well. So today, our objective is to provide an overview of a community-based and collaborative process that we've used to plan a culturally relevant program for implementing a child savings account program in the Marshallese community. To do that, we're going to cover several things on our agenda today. We're going to start off by giving you a snapshot of the Northwest Arkansas and the Marshallese community, just to put that in context. Then we're going to provide an overview of key components of the proposed process. We're going to talk about planning, development, and implementing the CSA program in the Marshallese community. And then we're going to provide a few details related to the program design, as well as each of the key components that fall under that design. And then, of course, we're going to talk about challenges and key considerations that are important to think about if you're interested in this work. And then we're going to conclude by giving you an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll provide some answers. So just to sort of frame it for you and put it in perspective for you, Northwest Arkansas has a population of about 525,032 people. It is the 22nd fastest growing area out of 382 areas in the country, and we pulled that information from the U.S. Census Bureau in 2017. There are approximately 31 new residents moving to Northwest Arkansas every day. So it's a really, really fast-growing population. If you think you want to come visit, think about that. It's a good, fast-growing place. There are several main towns that compose the metropolitan area. One is Fayetteville, and that's where Marsha and I live. That's where the university is located. It's the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And then there's the Springdale-Rogers area, and that has the largest Hispanic and Marshallese community located in that area. And that's where Lucy lives, and that's where the agency that she works for, the Arkansas Coalition Marshallese, is housed in that area. And then there's Bentonville. And Bentonville is the home of Walmart, which is the largest business in the entire world. And it also brings in, because of Walmart's presence, we are very unique in that we also have a lot of corporate businesses in that area. So we have Walmart, the largest business. We have Tyson's Trucking Company, which is the largest industry. And then we have Tyson's Chicken, which is the largest industry, and then J.B. Hunt, which is the largest trucking company. So because of those three business entities, there are a lot of resources and opportunities in the Northwest Arkansas area. I know when people think about Arkansas, a lot of times they think about us as a very poor rural state, which we are. Northwest Arkansas is a very different part of the state, and my wish, and I think all of our wish, is that we can do a better job of sharing the resources that are available in Northwest Arkansas across the entire state. So that's kind of who we are in a nutshell.
So Northwest Arkansas Marshallese community, the path from the Marshall Islands to Northwest Arkansas, the Compact Agreement. Approximately 11,000 Marshallese, 2,500 children reside in Northwest Arkansas, largest population outside of the Marshall Islands. Why implement CSA in the Marshallese community or child saving account? Close to 80% of Marshallese households are low income. 52% of Marshallese households live in poverty. 51% of Marshallese youth complete high school, less likely to complete college due to cost. Community interest and support. Focus group indicated a high interest in the support among the Marshallese community and collective and supportive culture.
So we just wanted to lay out the key components of our planning process, and this occurred in several different steps. We wanted to lay the groundwork for a child savings account planning project. We wanted to nurture community partnerships and clarify roles within those partnerships. And we sought out planning and implementation funding. And then we looked, once we got funding, into CSA, Child Savings Account Program development and implementation. And then finally, we planned out for an evaluation and dissemination process. So we're going to talk about these pieces. So at the beginning, Yvette and I have been putting together either IDA programs, which are adult dedicated savings accounts to purchase a home, go to college, start or expand a small business over the last 20 years. And so my goal from the beginning, and I think of that too, has been we want to do this with children, start out young so that kids can know that their families, friends, and their communities are investing in their future, in their college education or job training. Well, funders over the years didn't want to work with kids, they wanted to work with adults. And the larger context was that low-income people can't save. Low-income people are simply impulse-driven and can't walk by something and not want to buy it. Well, we proved them wrong over the last 20 years. Not only can low-income people save, but they can save at higher rates often than moderate income folks. And so we finally came to a point where we've been meeting with funders and talking to them over the years about we really want to put together a child savings account program in communities in Northwest Arkansas that are the most vulnerable if they want it. So our main question was, what if Marshallese children, many of whom face the greatest challenges and the fewest opportunities for educational achievement, are provided with real, culturally relevant opportunities to dream about and save for post-secondary education? So child savings accounts are just one way in which low and moderate income Marshallese children can save for post-secondary education and job training. Child savings accounts are dedicated savings accounts designed to help low and moderate income children create tangible goals for the future. Dedicated savings accounts are simply savings that may get matched by a funder. So if I save $100 for my child, the program will match $100 for that. And so the Marshallese child, family, friends, and community members are encouraged to invest in the child's CSA throughout the child's educational career. And so we'll talk, if we have time, a little bit about a kickoff event about even other ideas that came about. Okay, so we were aware, Yvette and I, that post-secondary education costs are often prohibitive for Marshallese and Latino youth in Northwest Arkansas. So with 20 years of experience on dedicated savings programs across the country, we reached out to the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation for support. They said they'll give us some funding, not much at all in the funding world, in order to just see who's out there who might be interested in working with us and going out and asking the community what they would want, which is what we do as social workers. But usually no one funds us for that. We do that part for free. And so we did. We went out and we enlisted the help of Melissa and Lucy and the ACOM staff, and wanted them to go ask, are folks interested? We also went out ourselves and met with Marshallese and Latino groups and forums and asked folks, here's an idea, a savings account for your child. Would you be interested in that? And overwhelmingly, folks were very interested in it and wanted to know more. I'm sorry, were you going to? Oh, okay. So with additional funding, since folks were interested, Winthrop Rockefeller said, okay, now we want you to go out and do what you always do next, which is to invite the key stakeholders in the communities, the Latino and the Marshallese communities, to come and learn about child savings account programs in more depth. because we really want to make sure if we're going to implement this, we want to make sure the community wants this. So we had a full day meeting, and we had a webinar with experts on child savings accounts throughout the country present information about it. At the end of the meeting, we asked all the groups that we would like for them to apply for a planning grant. It wasn't very much money. I think it was, what, $2,000? And we wanted to get with 2 different agencies and ask them to, again, go out into the community and ask them, what kind of accounts would you like, what would you need? Now, we knew a lot about IDAs from all the work we've done, and so we would meet, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we received 2 applications for this planning grant. One was from ACOM, and the other was from the Economic Opportunity Agency, a local agency in the same building with ACOM, who has managed financially the accounts for the last 20 years for IDAs, for adult savings accounts, and some teens. And so they said, we want to work, but only, we don't want to work on our own and ACOM work on their own. We want to work together as a team, if that's possible.
So we'll tell you a little bit about the ACOM and a little bit about the EOA, the 2 agencies. ACOM is the primary and most respected community-based agency in Northwest Arkansas in regards to the Marshallese community. They are the hub. They have the trust, they have the relationship, they're the leader, they provide an array of services. And when we were talking to the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, they said to us, you guys need to make sure you connect with ACOM. They had funded ACOM to do a series of other efforts in terms of building their capacity to do even greater work in the community. And they look at ACOM as what they call a mission critical agency, meaning that in order for the foundations to accomplish their goals, one of which is economic development and post-secondary education, they say in order, and the other one is social justice and racial healing. In order to accomplish those goals, they knew that they needed to have partners from diverse communities. And for the Marshallese community, ACOM was the agency they selected. But ACOM has demonstrated success in engaging the Marshallese community on important issues that include, but are not limited to, public health care, which is our kind of a state insurance plan called Our Kids for Marshallese children, driver's education courses in the Marshallese language, employee relations at the largest employer in Northwest Arkansas, which is Tyson's Food. As I mentioned earlier, one of the largest industries in the world is right there. And they hire a significant number of Marshallese residents or citizens residents in Arkansas to work for there. And then they also have worked with Pacific Islander Education and Daycare Celebration. And then the other agency is the Economic Opportunity Agency. And EOA is the primary deliverer of economic support services in Springdale, Arkansas. And as Marcia said, they're located in the same building with ACOM, so it was just really a natural partnership. But EOA has a long history of serving the Marshallese community in lots of different areas and sort of supporting the work that they do. EOA has a staff about a very fairly large staff, and they have over 20 years of experience in implementing the individual development asset accounts. And so, again, the work that Marcia and I do is focused on asset development, and that means just opportunities to move people towards prosperity, and that includes education, entrepreneurship, and home ownership. But ACOM has worked, EOA has worked with us in many years as kind of being the community provider of those services, and they also provide a lot of other services related to just general services and financial needs that are happening in the community. So trying to meet those. So what we did is we wanted to formalize the partnership. And we started by doing something that I've heard you guys talk about a lot today. We sat down and we said, okay, we're all in this together. We actually developed a formal memorandum of agreement, and that agreement was based upon us talking together about what are our strengths and assets. What do we as individual partners bring to the table, and how would we like to work together? So it wasn't the university telling the community or the community telling the agency. we all agreed that ACOM, as the community partner representing the Marshallese community, needed to be at the center. But then we also said we all have individual strengths and assets, and how do we, as a group, think we should formalize those? And so that was a very important process, and we actually spelled it out in an MOU. If you're thinking about doing this work, just some considerations. You have to think about role clarity. Again, developing the MOU is one way to solidify that, so that everyone's clear on what their role is. Trust is a huge issue, and rightfully so. As you guys talked about earlier, a lot of folks kind of go into any diverse community, and they want to ask a lot of questions, gather a lot of information, and they sort of take, but they never give back. As we understand, and as was pointed out earlier, there's a cultural reciprocity, a cultural value around reciprocity. So we really wanted to honor that, and so figuring out ways that we can give back and forth to one another, ways that we can build that trust, and early on in the process, and making sure that we're keeping it as we move on. And then you have to think about funding, engage all the partners in exploring funding to support implementation, and you want to engage those partners as early on. And we were fortunate enough to find a partner that really gets what we're trying to do in terms of community-based participatory research. As a matter of fact, we kind of introduced from the university, we introduced that concept to the funder years ago, and they've sort of bought into it. But it's funny, because as we were beginning to sort of think about this project with the Marshallese community, they reminded us that we needed to slow down a little bit and go back and make sure we really truly engaged the Marshallese community before going to the next step. So that was their reason for giving us that very small grant initially, to make sure that we could focus on community engagement before moving on. And then there's some communication things that you have to think about in terms of implementing the process to facilitate communication. Who's going to keep notes? How are you going to share information? How are you going to make sure everyone has access to that information? And then we also had to think about dissemination. How are we going to implement a plan to make sure that the information that we collect as a team, the three agencies and the foundation collect, how are we going to get that information out there in that word? How are we going to share that? So we did that, and we decided that we were going to meet on a bi-weekly basis, and so that was very helpful in terms of building trust, building relationships, and keeping the communication flowing. And then EOA shared best practices in terms of savings and possible saving vehicles, and we decided to use what's called the Arkansas 529 Gift Plan, and so they helped us to understand the details around that. ACOM conducted the focus groups with key stakeholders in the community and with the Marshallese parents to gauge their interest. They actually sort of went through and coded the data and sort of finalized the data, came up with those key themes, and sort of gave recommendations back to the team about here's where the community would like to go. They shared the focus group findings with EOA, and they actually, EOA and ACOM worked together to submit a final report to the university that we then had to pass on to the foundation. So in the long and short of it, the Marshallese community unanimously supported engagement in the Child Savings Account program. As a matter of fact, during the focus group process, they were saying, can we sign up now? Can we sign up now?
Mm-hmm. So this is my interesting part over here, because I was the one conducting the focus group and do the survey. The families told me to offer CSA to eligible children from ages 0 to 17 years. They told me to offer CSA to all their family member, like all the children, because they don't want to account for only one child in the family, but they want to include everyone. So offer Arkansas 529 College give plan vehicles to the saving and home for a child's education, allow many children from one family to enroll in the CSA program on first come, first served basis, offer financial education, educational opportunities that teach about banking and credit system. Many wanted their employers to offer a direct deposit option, easier to make CSA deposit.
And I want to jump in and say that these recommendations were a huge depart from the way we had been doing business in the past, and a huge depart from a way a lot of individual development accounts or CSA accounts specifically have been set up in the past. For example, typically from a research standpoint, we pick one child so that we can track it and follow it. So it worked for research, but it didn't work for the community. And so that was a big change for us when the community said, no, we don't want to have to pick one child. That's not how we roll. We're a very collective community, and no, we want to offer this to every child in a family. So that was a huge depart for us. So that was really important. The other piece is they said, no, it's important to focus on birth to 17. We were trying to figure out, do we start early? Do we start middle? Do we start young? And they said, no, none of that. You cover the entire gamut from birth to 18.
That's right. So it was killing our research. And we're like, yeah, that's all right. We're still going to get some good information because this is a pilot project, and the goal is our long-term goal, whether we hit it or not, is we want to follow these kids up until they're 25. And so obviously we're going to have to get more research funding for that. So you know about the CSA project team composition. We had also been speaking to the United Way of Northwest Arkansas over the years just about what we were doing, and they were very interested in CSAs. And we also invited them to that webinar. So they came to me and said, hey, we'd like you to apply for funding for a CSA program for the Marshallese community. And we said, okay, we're in a perfect position to do so. So we all got together and put all our pieces together and applied for the funds. And we were funded for 2 years. Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, on hearing that, said, okay, we'll provide $20,000 for 200 seed grants for the kids, and the United Way will provide $100 also for incentive funds, and those incentives can be for attending classes or getting direct deposit from your workplace. And then the Arkansas Treasurer's Office, where the 529 college gift accounts will come from, they said, okay, we're going to start by offering $5,000 so you can get more kids involved, and there may be more money in that in the future. So thanks. This took several years. Like many people have talked, it takes several years to get these things going and build relationships, but it's certainly worth it. Well, you probably can't see that anyway, but this is just a logic model, and I don't enjoy logic models, but it does give kind of an overview of who's going to do what, and and what kind of assumptions we're making, what kind of outputs and outcomes we're looking for. And then the key deliverables. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'll run through those real quickly. But we laid out for each around this role clarity again, ACOM, this is their baby, this is their community, and so they're doing the recruitment and the interviewing and collecting the data. Lucy's done a lot of in translation, happily so, and so they're going to have more medium touch case management services. The Economic Opportunity Agency, they're going to engage in a train the trainer. So we have a banker, Janet, who's a consultant and has done IDAs. She's training the ACOM staff on the economic education classes that are of interest to the community. And then our team is we provide overview of the project. We're also going to seek out additional funds. We also are doing the data analysis for the child accounts in hopes that you need that evaluation to get future funding as well to do a much larger project. So here's the CSA program eligibility. There aren't many eligibility problems here, so that's great. And then case management services, there's going to be training on how to read their 529 college gift plan, those quarterly statements, so families can keep up and teaching the children. College preparation training, starting early with the children. Savings support, seeing what else is out there, and referral and broker services for personal, social, and economic challenges. Lucy has a counseling background. We would love to also see some social work students in there to provide support for her. And then the program evaluation, we're looking at the savings, obviously, how many accounts were open, how much savings is happening over time. We're going to do financial education, pre and post tests. Are the classes helping any? And the survey, we're going to take it at baseline and then 18 to 24 months, knowing that we're probably not going to see many behavioral health changes over time or in other areas. But some of the basic outcomes we're looking at is general health and mental health, social support, food security, economic strain, self-efficacy, future orientation, fringe economy utilization, and household financial capital. Michael Sheridan had said, who started this whole project 20-some years ago, that household income feeds people's stomachs, but assets change their heads. And so, meaning that if a child is born knowing that they have even $50 saved towards their college education, they know growing up that their parents or their loved ones are investing in them. And the research shows that whether it's $50 or $5,000, the effect is the same for children, knowing that their future orientation, they start thinking more about their future and behaving in ways not to jeopardize that future. So the CSA research field is still young, but we hope over the next 10, 20 years to have a lot more information because of projects like this. All right.
This project will be the first in the world with the Marshallese population, we're already anticipating some great outcomes. We had a kickoff in September, just to sort of make the community aware, that kickoff day, and at that kickoff, we had, since that kickoff, 173 people have enrolled. Enrollment doesn't begin till Monday, and we only have 200 slots. And so 173 people have already signed up for those slots, which never happens. It normally takes years, at least a year, to fill that many slots in most communities. So.
And that's because of ACOM.
All because of ACOM.
Yeah. All right, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm from Fayetteville in that area and had no idea this was going on, so I'm going to need a sit down and really know a little bit more. Our next speaker is Ms. Jacqueline Schmidt-Busby. Ms. Busby is the Research Fellow for Counties Manitowoc Health, who awarded her a 3-year scholarship to undertake a PhD with the University of Auckland. Jacqueline has over 25 years of experience in human resource management, strategic planning, and strategic management across a number of industries. And more recently, program manager for regional health projects that focus on a long-term conditions spanning both clinical and social sectors. Jacqueline is Samoan and takes a strategic approach to actions that facilitate the assessment, development, and implementation of quality and cultural safety programs, initiatives to advance positive health outcomes. Welcome, Jacqueline Schmidt-Busby. Thank you.
Now,
Is this you? No.
no.
Okay, and then just click from there.
Malolo Suifua, Talofalava, I'm Jacqueline, as I've been introduced. And I am a research fellow for Counties Manukau Health, which is the Middlemore Hospital in South Auckland, and also a PhD student at the University of Auckland. Before I begin, please allow me to introduce myself so that I can establish a relationship between myself and you, my new friends and colleagues, and also locate myself within my research. I was brought up predominantly in a Samoan household. We, as you can see by the band I Am Samoan European, but unfortunately I had a very strong Samoan mother, so my father didn't have any choice but to come across to the Samoan side. My village is Safotu in the top of Savaii in Samoa. As introduced, I've worked in a lot of industries, mainly in the area of problem solving, business and operational strategy, and most recently within health. In the last 3 years, I worked in an innovation and improvement unit, developing and leading a lot of community-based projects within long-term conditions or chronic disease and chronic illness in both primary and secondary and also community settings. So at the moment, I've just completed the first year of my PhD, and so today my talk is about my PhD, where I will present to you the first phase of the findings. I'll begin by giving a background, so it provides a backdrop to my study, and then the second half of the talk I will focus on the findings of the first phase. Research begins with a research question, and I've always had something for Pacific people, mainly Samoan, and the way that we expect to get long-term illnesses, and we expect to have a shorter lifespan than most other people, and it's bothered me for the most of my life. So my overall research question asks, what are the factors that influence opportunities for Pacific with type 2 diabetes to engage in self-management of their illness? And to help me answer that question, I'm also looking at the contextual factors that delay or prevent disease, personal, service and clinical factors associated with diabetic kidney disease, the hopes and expectations of the individuals with the diseases held, and what opportunities exist to delay or prevent progression of the disease. Now note, I use diabetic kidney disease as a proxy in this study for disease progression and also comorbidities. So motivation for the study, why do people with diabetes, especially Pacific people, end up dying of renal failure? And as we've got so many resources, research, supports and interventions in place, what's going on in the system that we're still dying? While there's technology in medicine and health has increased over the decades, the numbers of Pacific people with long-term conditions has not improved. I'm interested to find out why this is so, especially when these diseases are preventable. As a background to Pacific and New Zealand, we are predominantly Samoan, Tongan, Cook Island and Uams, and most of us live in the urban areas of Auckland and Wellington. We do have other Pacific coming through, like the Marshall Islands, a lot of Hawaiians coming through, the Chooks and Yap Islanders, so the numbers are increasing. Auckland is known as the Polynesian capital of the world, but it's becoming more multi-ethnic with regards to Micronesian and Melanesian ethnicities. Pacific make up almost 8% of our population. And of that 8%, or 344,000, 80% are approximately 20 years and over, of which 12% have diabetes. Now 12% probably doesn't really look very high, but if you correlate it with the number with obesity, then we start to look at that 12% again. As a total population, just like here in the States and around the Pacific, diabetes is highest within Pacific Island populations compared to the rest of the other populations. And as we get older, it doesn't get any better. For example, in South Auckland, by the age of 60 to 64, 39% of us will have diabetes versus 7% European. Comorbidities are also highest amongst Pacific Island populations. Another problem is that caring for diabetes requires a huge amount of self-management. In this context, I place self-management support, which is the services, resources and information provided by the health system, along with self-care, which is the daily activities that we do to undertake diabetes management, together under the umbrella of self-management support. And more than any other long-term condition, diabetes requires constant management. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's relentless. In New Zealand, approximately 6 hours over the entire year is planned self-management support. And by that I mean you've got a planned appointment with a nurse practitioner or a clinician to manage or talk about your diabetes. What this means is that the rest of the hours, 3,754 hours, is spent either managing alone or with a carer or family support. And for those with more than one condition, which is most of us, self-management becomes more complex. The overarching problem is that Pacific have low engagement in self-management, but the underlying context is both multifaceted and it's complex. All of these are problems, but do you know what the biggest problem I find that really grates on my wick? It's so what? We've got an abundance of data, we know what the issues are, but what are we going to do with it already? How much more data do we have to collect before we actually start using it and operationalising it and making a difference? We need to challenge ourselves to take the next step. So I challenge all of you here to think about it. Take the next step. What are we going to do with the data? Yes, as researchers and people interested in closing the gap, we're networking to build knowledge and literature surrounding diabetes and closing the gap and disparities. Yes, that's important. And yes, there are system responses such as self-management education and community-based initiatives, and these are important too, but these are inadequate. Are they long-term responses from a health system to address the health needs of Pacific people, or are they just short-term fix? Considering that the contributing influences of our problems stem from social factors. So, our friend Alapati, or Albert Einstein, I really like the fact that he said we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. Services that offer more of the same cannot effectively address the health disparities of Pacific with diabetes and other chronic conditions. We're great at building the evidence and putting in initiatives in an attempt to address these problems. But what we're not great at doing is learning from our past to change the future. Yes, the past can mean our ancestors, but in this context, I mean talking to people at the end of their lives who have gone through the same health system that we're trying to change and asking them what is most important to them and what would they do if they were 20 years younger and they had all this knowledge. What would they do to change the system? What would they do to change their own selves? What is it that needs to happen going forward? I want the brutal truth of what they would say, not the politically correct or the polite version, but what is it that they would really tell their families, their clinicians, and themselves? My study will hopefully help this process, but in order to do that, I need to understand the whole system, the whole perspectives within the self-management program. So as mentioned before, my purpose of the study is to understand the conditions that affect the ability of Pacific with diabetes to engage in the self-management of their illness. And by doing this, can I identify opportunities that can delay or prevent disease? When I say understand the conditions, I'm talking about the context, which lies behind the context, which we often stop at. When I talk about the challenge, we look behind the curtain, but I want to look behind the other curtains that also keep going. So the overall study, my overall PhD study looks like this. It's a mixed method, multi-study project that will answer my research question. And just note that if you're all here for the plenary on the first day by Stevenson, when he was talking about health sovereignty, That's salutogenic theory. Salutogenic means health, whereas pathogenesis means disease. So we're all on the same wavelength. And the thing that salutogenic talks about is the resilience of people and their own resources. But today, as alluded to earlier, I'm going to talk about the results of phase 1. So for phase 1, my literature review, I decided not just to do a straight literature review. I decided to do something that's going to actually help me. Rather than just talk about the literature, because there's lots of literature, I wanted to do an evaluation of the self-management program. Now, a realist evaluation is a theory-driven appraisal that allows you to understand the complex interactions between the components of a program. Basically, what works for whom and in what circumstances. It uses a context mechanism outcome equation to evaluate the effectiveness of the self-management program. So in this example, the context is the person with diabetes and everything that comes with them, their family, their context, where they were born, what they know, what they don't know, the money, everything about them. The mechanism I'm going to use is adherence. Adherence to 5 things that are identified by both the New Zealand health system and also the ADA here in the US. And those are adherence to glucose monitoring, appropriate diet, regular exercise, medications, and appointment keeping. Those are the 5 things that they identify. If you've got diabetes, you must do those 5 things, if nothing else. And the outcome, do you get a health outcome that's positive, or do you get one that's negative, or in between? If you know realist theory or methodology, it uses a circular motion where you identify an initial theory. So what I'm saying is that, okay, self-management, how is it supposed to work? That's the initial theory. On paper, how does this theory work? And then it goes on, you come up with an hypothesis how it might work, you do a testing, and then you find out whether you were right or wrong. So my initial theory was self-management is an effective program for managing diabetes. It sounds good, and that's what we commonly know. When you have a long-term condition, the first point of call is self-management in one form or another. From that, my hypothesis was self-management effectively helps all individuals with diabetes regardless of socio-economic circumstances. To do this, I did use literature, and I pulled 30 articles from a number of countries that concentrated on diabetes self-management and or other chronic conditions. Using the context mechanism outcome equation upon the literature showed that the literature showed that self-management does facilitate access, ideal communication, experiences, and family support. It does do that. But it also has more barriers. It has a heck of a lot more barriers. And it's the same barriers as the facilitators. And the key barriers to the barriers are low self-efficacy, financial constraints, and time constraints. And they all have a tri-directional relationship with each other. So how does this look from the perspective of self-management program effectiveness? Well, the diabetes self-management program will only bring about change, positive health gain, for individuals with diabetes if it's triggered by a mechanism, in this case adherence, acting in the right circumstances or context. So what that means, that if everything's going A-OK, and all the supports and access and affordability is in place, then positive health gains are seen. Facilitators enable positive health gains and barriers stem this gain. Affordability is the major barrier. We all know this. But remember, I'm not looking at patient outcomes here. I'm looking at the effectiveness of the diabetes self-management system program. Affordability, being unable to afford anything, being unable to afford daily costs and diabetes-related costs stops you dead in your tracks. And when you hear stories that people aren't being aren't adhering to the medications, they're not picking them up, affordability could be the problem. But we all know that, right? I won't go through all the possibilities here of my logic model, as I'll be here for ever and a day, but I will go through a few. Affordability also places a prioritisation on what is most important to the forefront. And that decision can be made daily, and it can be made hourly, it can be made whenever a decision needs to be made. And decision making doesn't just mean having a look at what's in the bank. This isn't to say that unaffordability completely prevents health gains, but how much health gain progress is attributed to the self-management program? And this is where I'm bringing in my salutogenic theory. How much is attributed to the factors of the people themselves, their resilience, their culture? How much is is them actually doing what they need to do to survive? What gets lost in low health literacy? Considering that decision making may not mean may mean limited choices, I did a previous study where with Samoan, and if you looked at the tools, it all equated to that Samoan had low health literacy in self-management of diabetes. But if you look behind both curtains, you see that it's not low health literacy. They know they had to take their tablets. They know they had to go for the walk, eat properly. But the reason why they didn't do that is because they had limited choices. They had to consider family options, work options. They couldn't afford it. So it's not low health literacy sometimes. It's the context, limited choices. And prioritisation can mean I just can't afford it at the moment, maybe tomorrow. So it's not a static state. Just like decision making occurs on a frequent basis, so does the state of whether you can afford it or not. And quite often, as Pacific people, we put ourselves 4th or 5th on the list. For diabetes and diabetic kidney disease and a lot of other long-term conditions, we don't feel it. It's invisible until it's too late. So if we're feeling all right, the tablets can wait because the kids need the food. I can work. It might be a bit sore, but I need the money to provide food for my family. So as a concluding statement, however, for many individuals, insufficient financial resources to cover daily living and diabetes-related expenses lead to coping strategies to offset costs. But coping with diabetes in the context of people's lives requires attention to a series of issues that are often outside the remit of the individual, the healthcare team, and the system in which health is located. Self-management of long-term conditions such as diabetes can no longer be managed under the umbrella of health. It requires multi-sector collaboration, multi-sector responsibility, and multi-sector accountability. Malo Papatai, thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm going to welcome our next two speakers, our final two speakers. We have Ms. Rebecca Delafield and Dr. Andrea Hermasora. Rebecca Delafield is a clinical research coordinator with the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the University of Hawaii, John A. Burns School of Medicine. She was born in the Northern Mariana Islands, raised in Iowa, and moved to Hawaii in 2004, shortly after graduating with a master's in public health degree from the University of North Carolina. Rebecca's work at the DNHH, or the Department of Native Hawaiian Health, focuses on community-based research studies that address health disparities in Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander groups. She is also a student and is currently in her second year at the community-based and translational health research doctoral program offered through the University of Hawaii Office of Public Health Studies. Dr. Andrea Hermosora is an associate professor at the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the John A. Burns School of Medicine at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is a researcher who is committed to improving the health and well-being of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders by addressing issues relevant to those communities. Her areas of research include Native Hawaiian health, health disparities, and cultural safety. She has extensive experience using the community-based participatory research approach to develop collaborative and equitable relationships with multiple stakeholders to reduce obesity disparities and to implement patient quality initiatives at a local healthcare system. In addition to research, she is also a licensed clinical psychologist who provides integrated behavioral health care in primary care clinic. Please welcome Dr. Hermosora and Rebecca Delafield. Is this one yours right here? Measuring okay. And then you can just advance with that.
Velina mai kako, mai kalahiki a kalakau. I have to make a correction to that. I'm not an associate professor. I'm an assistant professor and a postdoctoral fellow. That's okay. I maybe made a typo. And the reason why we're doing this work is because I've done a lot of research during my studies on racism and how that impacts different chronic illnesses like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. But now the research is moving from blatant racism to more subtle or implicit bias. And so now Becky and I have the honor and the privilege to start to develop an instrument to measure this within the socio-cultural context of Hawaii. So we'll be talking about that today. It's a privilege to be here today and to be presenting here with Dr. Hermosora. Out of curiosity, how many of you have heard about implicit or unconscious bias before? And how many of you have actually seen measures of it in your work? Okay, all right. So we're going to give you a brief background of it, and the definitions that we're working with today include both. We're going to talk about implicit and explicit bias, so you have a sense of the differences between the two. So implicit or unconscious bias is a positive or negative attitude or stereotype towards a person, thing, or group that are outside our conscious awareness, so unconscious bias. And then explicit or conscious bias is the same thing, but with an awareness of that bias, and it's under conscious control. So unconscious and conscious bias can work together, but they can also be very separate. So someone can be actively anti-racist and still can have unconscious biases. And we're going to talk about that some more, because we want to know how these unconscious biases affect us. They affect our understandings and interactions and decisions. They're usually based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, but can also be based on gender, age, social class, and appearance. They may influence our attitudes and feelings, and that's really where the concern about bias comes into play, is not that we have them, because we all have them, but it's how we behave under these influences to others and also to ourselves, I'd say. And they may also result in discriminatory practices, especially under demanding or stressful circumstances. So basically the pathways is that you have a learned association, that something you're exposed to, or a pairing of ideas that's repeated over time, and then you can develop a bias or a preference towards that thing, and then you may end up acting in a discriminatory manner as a result. So this is going to be a short video. I'm going to have to ask for forgiveness because there's a ad ahead of the video because we pulled it off of YouTube. So you can kind of do a silent protest if you want. But hopefully it will only last for a minute, and hopefully I can get it to go. Yeah, we are not endorsing this. I don't even know what one it is.
Go-getters and should-be sleepers from all of us at Delta. Because the ones who truly change the world are the ones who can't wait to get out in it.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Okay. So, sorry. Okay. So the kind of biases we're going to talk about today are bias based on race and ethnicity. And so I had spoken to you earlier about how learned associations can create bias, and that may lead to discriminatory practices. Within societies that have racism, overt and explicit experiences of racism, where negative stereotypes can be promulgated, the woman in the video talked about this fog, where you hear that often. Those ideas can be put into our heads and associated with certain ethnic or racial groups. That can lead to bias, that can lead to discrimination, and then that can feed into the racism that already exists. So it becomes this kind of cyclical experience. So, as I said before, one of the reasons why we want to talk about this is because we know that our biases impact others. Explicit bias in the U.S. has contributed to disparities in housing, in education, and in justice systems. And there is research that is showing that implicit biases also influence hiring practices in the U.S., admissions to educational institutions, treatment of students of color in classrooms, and interactions with and treatment by healthcare providers.
And so we're going to focus on implicit bias in healthcare a little bit, because it's just as common among healthcare professionals as the wider population. It can affect things like treatment decisions and diagnoses. Some of the research shows that it affects access, quality, and outcomes. So compared to their white counterparts, people of color are usually less satisfied with healthcare interactions. They may be kept waiting longer for assessment and treatment, and they may spend less time with their providers. And it manifests itself in different nonverbal behaviors toward the patient. So there may be less eye contact, which may be respectful in some cultures, but if you look at the way they treat different people and the only differences are race or ethnicity, it's significantly different. There's also a difference in physical proximity, so you tend to stand closer to people you feel more comfortable around. And then using a dominant or condescending tone of voice, that can play out as well. Implicit bias is much more difficult to address than explicit bias, especially because many times it doesn't align with our declared beliefs or reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. And so a lot of times people are shocked by, if they take an assessment on implicit bias, what might come out of it, because you may be doing everything to support a certain racial or ethnic group, but your results are completely different. And so the idea is that everyone, like the video said, everyone has biases, and it's not only in bad people. And there is a significant difference between racists and people who have implicit biases. Where do implicit biases come from? So our brains are capable of processing 11 million bits of information every second, but we only process about 40 bits of information. And so our brains, like Dr. Samoa talked about in Thinking Fast or Slow by Kahneman, created a way for us to process all this information. And so we have our unconscious processing system, which is our fast brain, and then we have our conscious processing system, which is our slow brain. And so our unconscious processing system operates automatically and is extremely fast. And so that's when you become an experienced driver, you start to know that a green light is associated with going. So without even thinking, you push on your gas pedal and you start to go. Whereas conscious processing involves tasks that require more concentration. So doing things like a job application or your taxes annually, it requires more cognitive capacity and more intention to do. And so like the video said, in our unconscious processing, there's a common stereotype that often associates Black people, especially men, with being dangerous. And because of this repeated association over time, average folks and police are more likely to shoot a Black person than a white person. But where does that come from? So a recent study by Color of Change found that while 51% of people are arrested for violent crimes like murder, theft, and assault in New York City, 75% of the news reports about such arrests highlighted Black alleged perpetrators. And so that's how, over time, we start to pair the stereotype of Black people being dangerous.
So now we're going to be talking sorry,
it's still me. Okay, now we're going to talk about measuring implicit bias. So we're focusing on the implicit association test, which was developed by Bonaji and Greenwald at Harvard University in 1998. It's basically a response latency assessment, which measures the relative strength of associations between pairs of concepts. So the task tends to be easier, and you respond quicker when the two concepts are highly associated. A lot of IATs that you can take online also include an explicit bias measure, although you don't get your results on the explicit bias part. But researchers are interested in whether or not there's a correlation between people who are explicitly biased and implicit bias, or implicitly biased. And there isn't a really strong correlation. It varies pretty widely. So some examples of existing implicit association tests that you can take online at this link include a weight IAT, skin tone IAT, a weapons IAT, and age IAT. The age IET is actually the most valid and the most robust of all the IETs that have been created since the 1980s. So the reason why we started out wanting to develop implicit association tests are that there's a lot of strengths. So it's the most widely used test to measure implicit bias. And even people who are familiar with the IAT, so you can understand what it measures, you can understand what it looks like, and you still get reliable effects. So it's a very robust and impervious test. It's also not impacted by social desirability, which is a big one, because a lot of people who take explicit bias measures know how you're supposed to respond to those things, and so they're not necessarily accurate indicators of your own biases. The weaknesses of the IATs is that it can only compare two concepts at a time. So you can only look at white and good, or white versus black, and then good versus bad. You can't compare across tests. So you can't do like young versus white, old versus white, or young versus black. There's no relative comparisons in that way. So the differences are relative. So now Becky's going to talk about how we're tailoring an IAT for the unique sociocultural context of Hawaii.
So when I say canoe in Iowa, which is where I grew up, the concept or the image that people draw, or that I would draw from before I came to Hawaii, or if I hadn't had exposure to the Pacific, would be very different from the one that I conjure up now when I say the word canoe. Context has a good deal to do with how you associate different things and where those ideas come from, like how those pairings are created. And so the publicly available IATs that were on the previous slide, weight, age, race, skin tone, skin color, those are all very useful for constructs that are familiar for a lot of the areas in the US. But if you're looking at the racial and ethnic dynamics here in Hawaii, we needed to create something different. One, there was just no Pacific groups that were part of the tests that were publicly available. So Andrea and I wanted to look at this issue in the context of Hawaii, which is often referred to as kind of a melting pot. It's a very diverse state. But still in Hawaii, there's evidence of racism against specific groups, and we were particularly interested in Micronesians and Native Hawaiians because we study health disparities, and so we understand that there are differences, and we also understand that those differences have not greatly improved in for a lot of the indicators that we've looked at, even though we're trying to culturally tailored programs and address behavior. And so we think this might be a factor that might have some kind of influence, not explain everything, but might have some kind of influence to what we're seeing in terms of these health indicators. And so I just wanted to explain that we started out doing this and we were going to say, oh, so Project Implicit is there, they create tests, we'll work with them and we'll make this test. And Keawe Koholokula was like, whoa, how are you going to decide how you're going to test and what terms are you going to use? Because Andrea and I were like, oh, we know that there's racism here. But actually what we did was we ended up writing an IRB protocol, writing our aims out, and trying to make sure that the test that we construct is reflective of some of the key or most relevant biases that the groups here experience. So what we'd like to do is develop 8 IATs. So again, you can only compare 2 groups, so you have to do repeated tests. So we're going to compare Native Hawaiian to Caucasian, Native Hawaiian to Japanese American, Micronesian, Caucasian, Micronesian, Japanese American. We'll measure both attitudinal differences, so kind of good, bad concepts associated with each group, and then also stereotypes for each pair. So we chose to look at these groups because of the social kind of context of Hawaii. Well, we also need to be able to demonstrate kind of a broader relevance to other places. Caucasians were a group that we wanted to include in this test. However, Caucasians don't always hold the best health outcomes in Hawaii. They're kind of a unique population here in the state. Japanese Americans actually have a lot of the best health indicators for the state. And so we ended up choosing this. There's also been another test that was done by Justin Levinson, who's actually a professor at the law school here, who looks at implicit bias within the judicial system. And so he had done a similar test that was just kind of online. It wasn't really as specifically tailored to health as we, or directed to healthcare providers like the one we're trying to do. So we kind of modeled it after what he was doing as well.
And we do have two dominant groups here, and that's also reflected in the groups that we chose.
So for the development of the test, we needed to do two steps. One is to develop the stimuli for the test. So there are some IATs that use images to compare groups, but we didn't think that that was a good way to go for our population because it's so diverse in terms of appearance, and if we tried to do that, it would just end up being like a stereotype image that we didn't think would be appropriate. And then we also wanted to do measure a stereotype. So that's usually some kind of construct that's it's a negative construct associated with a particular group. So, for example, there was a study done in New Zealand that compared Maori to European New Zealanders, and they used a construct of compliance versus non-compliance. And so the first step is to develop the stimuli. The second step is to actually conduct the test. So we'll recruit healthcare providers to take a battery of the IATs. So step one is actually ongoing. Again, we got IRB approval to go forward. We were going to do an online survey, which has been completed. And what the survey did was collect negative stereotypes. So what was the top 3 negative stereotypes that you're aware of for each of the 4 populations we were looking at in Hawaii? And that was sent out to a group of experts. And the experts we defined as people who had studied racial ethnic dynamics in Hawaii and also people who had experience in healthcare. And then in order to kind of check the validity of the information we got back from that survey, we conducted 3 focus groups. And we're currently analyzing the data from that to determine if we're going to continue with the focus groups or if we have reached a point where there's agreement between the focus groups and we can stop. And then the second step again is to implement with healthcare providers. So I kind of mentioned this already. There was the online survey. What we did once we got the survey results back was kind of collapse the responses into several categories so that terms were kind of grouped together. So if someone said uneducated and another person said stupid, then those were put together in the same group. We presented the top 3 categories to our focus group participants and asked them to review, to assess, to revise, and to rank which was the most common, the one that they had been seeing the most here in Hawaii. And so again, we're still analyzing that, but the findings from the expert survey, we got 30 responses, I believe. And then what was interesting about them is that the negative stereotypes for Native Hawaiians, for Micronesians, and for Caucasians clustered together pretty clearly. So if someone said one concept like uneducated, there were a lot of people who had the similar synonyms. And then for Japanese Americans, that finding was more diffuse. So there were hardly 3 terms that we could put together into one category. And one of the things we're thinking is that, one, there could be that there aren't that many negative stereotypes for Japanese Americans in Hawaii because they are a dominant group. Or it could be that because we took them out of Asian, like an Asian category, that we're people didn't identify the negative stereotypes that Japanese Americans are actually exposed to, but because we took them out of that aggregated group of Asian, people weren't identifying those. So
the good news is that we can do something about it. We can measure implicit bias, address it, and then reverse it through interventions. The intervention literature in this area is much newer than the assessment of it, but there's suggestions for individuals as well as institutions. So one of the first things you can do is increase your self-awareness, and that's why we're creating these IATs, is to increase your awareness about biases, and then to use that increased awareness to identify how those biases may or may not affect your behaviors toward a different group. And then also educating yourself about implicit bias and their potential consequences. We ask people to individuate, so look at personal characteristics rather than group stereotypes. Engage with others toward whom you have biases, and identify real life counter stereotypic examples. So they talk about Barack Obama as someone who's not stereotypically Black in terms of the stereotype that the association between Black and dangerous. Some institutional strategies are suggested as well, and so Dr. Evans talked about some of the policy changes, not publicly, but to me, which I think I'm super excited about. But you can require education and training workshops on unconscious biases, talk about areas in healthcare where there is a high level of stress and we're prone to biases, and to address that proactively. Develop guidelines or formal protocols to check and correct implicit bias, and then to consider how different cultures are represented on campus or in your institution or in the public arena. So we have a quick activity. I know we're coming to time, so thank you for hanging out with us. But we want you guys to go as fast as you can. Basically, you want to say the name of the color. So you want to read the color. Read the word, not identify. Oh, okay. I think it's changed. Okay, so say the name of the color when you see the slide, okay?
no, oh sorry.
Green, okay.
No, go.
Blue. Okay, so you can see that in the beginning it was a lot easier because it was consistent, right? So red was in red. But as you got toward the end, it took a lot more concentration and cognitive processing to follow the instructions as we indicated. And that's an example of how we need to slow down our cognitive processing to be able to change implicit biases. And so that's just a quick activity for that. And being a psychologist and a behaviorist, we always like to leave with an action plan. And so we ask all of you to think about one thing you'd like to commit to manage your own bias, whether or not it's taking an IAT that's publicly available on the link that we gave you earlier, or engage with people who you think you might have biases toward, or to read more in the literature. And then finally, we just want to acknowledge the Queen's Health System Native Hawaiian Health Initiative, who funds both Becky and my positions, as well as our research. And they've invested in the development of these IATs. And we'd also like to mahalo the Department of Native Hawaiian Health and the experts and focus group participants who make this research possible. Mahalo, everyone.
One more round of applause to our wonderful presenters. We don't have time for Q&A, I'm sorry, but you can meet them out, during lunch and ask your questions. And We will have open the door, the sessions upstairs. I think one of them is done. So it'll come. Our closing ceremony will be very short. You know, just thank you and then let's say so. But we need to pray for the food because any food you eat before a prayer will add extra calories. So you know, we just have to follow protocols and things like that. So you just give about 5-10 minutes for transition. And again, thank you to the presenters.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Thank you so much. So did I give you?
Yes, because I did one of your.
I was so happy.
Don't leave without filling out evaluations or Nia will get you.
I'm getting started when it's hot.
I screwed it all.
You should save me.
Yeah.
What's the title of the book? Families who need more and help. It's nice.
Oh, that would be interesting.
You see what that, you might not see it. I had Ella order us, books, 2 books that, related to her. It's about a program that they researchers that have been studying her for a while.
Oh, interesting. So I have a question. When of Lucy, and this would help us. So about a year ago. Hi. Thank you. Okay. So UAMS came out, wanted to, wanted.
Yeah.
And talked to our faculty last year about health in the Marshallese population. One of the things she had said is that when someone gets sick, that oftentimes there's a stigma in that, like if a woman gets, uterine cancer, that might mean that she's promiscuous. Is that stuff
It's still happening. Yeah, it's still happening. Yeah.
And
Still
so,
going on.
and then the family kind of backs away, and it's like, I said, but that's the time she needs them most.
Yes. Yeah. Some families like moving away and doesn't want to connect with that certain person. Yeah, that individual. Yeah. But there are some that like really support it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the really close ones can be the husband or the family of the husband where they like make the disconnection.
My gosh. Yeah. So what happens if she then gets better? Do they come back, or is that relationship ruined?
The relationship is still ruined. Yeah. Yeah. They don't pay attention to her. They don't talk to her anymore.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
Yeah, it is. It is very sad.
Is that just certain families that do that? Very old-fashioned?
Well, old-fashioned families are
Yeah.
doing that. And I know it when I for the Kuguris. The work, the jobs opportunities. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it is with a guy named what was the name again? Moody, Mr. Moody. Yeah, he was the one come to Heaney and then he come to Arkansas and started inviting families of his families and then the